It was the kind of night New York didn't plan for. Not stormy, not loud, but silent, like the city was holding its breath. The rain had stopped hours ago, leaving the streets slick and shining under the flicker of tired neon signs. Cigarette smoke curled from the shadows, and in the Lower East Side, whispers replaced music. People walked faster, eyes low, as if something dangerous was moving in the air. The dangerous thing was a man, and tonight, that man was leaving Mulberry Street in the back of a police car. They called him Lucky Luciano. To the cops, he was a kingpin. To the politicians, a necessary evil. To the street kids running numbers and delivering packages, he was something between a hero and a ghost story. But to himself, Lucky was just a man who had learned early that the world didn't give you a damn thing, you took it. And when you took it, you kept it. Even from inside a cell. The headlights cut through the mist as two detectives stepped out, their coats heavy with rain, their hats pulled low. This wasn't an arrest that needed shouting or handcuffs on the sidewalk. No, this was a gentleman's arrest, the kind reserved for men whose power wasn't measured in muscle but in how many phone calls it took to make a problem disappear. But the problem tonight was Thomas E. Dewey, and Dewey wasn't disappearing. Dewey was the kind of man who could walk into a room full of armed gangsters and make them put out their cigars. That was new for Lucky, and he didn't like new. Inside the car, Luciano sat calm, his hands folded like he was on his way to a dinner reservation. He looked out the window, watching the storefronts slide by, the bakers locking up, the bars closing. He thought about the men he'd seen rise and fall, about the ones who didn't have the sense to plan for a day like this. His mind wasn't on the trial or the sentence. His mind was on the machine he had built, a machine so finely tuned it could run without him. Or so he hoped. Out on the sidewalks, guys who owed him money leaned against lampposts, pretending not to notice the black sedan. A few gave small nods, the kind that said, "We know you'll be back." It was a strange kind of loyalty, the quiet, unspoken kind. That's how Lucky liked it. No flowers, no crowds, no noise. Just the work. Always moving, always earning. The car rolled past Mulberry Street, past the bakery where he used to buy bread for a nickel, past the barbershop where every cop in the city seemed to get their haircut for free. These streets were his foundation, his kingdom. And yet, as the tires hummed on wet asphalt, he felt the cold distance of the night pressing in. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't the man making the calls, he was the man waiting to see who would. One of the detectives in the front seat broke the silence. "You know, Lucky," he said without turning around. "Dewey's got you this time." Luciano smiled, just a little. "Kid," he said, "I've been hearing that since I was 16. His voice was smooth, unhurried, the kind of voice that made you wonder if he knew something you didn't. The detective didn't answer. Maybe he knew that with Lucky, silence was safer. They reached the courthouse entrance, the yellow glow of the lamps catching in the wet pavement. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old paper and cigar smoke. Reporters were already there, their notebooks ready, their flashbulbs loaded. When Luciano stepped out, he didn't look at them. He didn't need to. He knew tomorrow's headlines were already written and half the quotes would be invented. The truth was, the public liked their criminals smart, dangerous, and well-dressed, and Lucky had always given them exactly that. As he walked down the hallway, the sound of his shoes echoed off the marble. He thought about the first time he walked into a police station, just a punk kid caught with a knife. Back then, the cops smirked and sent him home with a warning. Now, they didn't smirk. Now, they took notes. They brought him into a holding room. A single wooden chair, a desk with scratches from years of interrogations, a light swinging slightly overhead. Lucky sat down like he owned the place. To him, rooms like this were just way stations, not destinations. He wasn't thinking about guilt or innocence, those were just words. He was thinking about the phone calls his men were making right now, the envelopes sliding across tables, the quiet deals that would ensure business went on at trial or no trial. Out in the city, the night carried on. In Little Italy, the restaurants stayed open late, their windows glowing warm against the damp streets. Somewhere uptown, a card game was being played where the house took its cut for Lucky. On the docks, crates were being unloaded under the watchful eyes of men who worked for him without ever knowing his name. The machine kept moving. That was the design. In the holding room, a guard brought him coffee in a chipped mug. Luciano took a sip, nodded once in approval. "Tell your wife thanks," he said. The guard almost smiled. It was easy to forget that even in chains, some men were still in charge. Hours later, when the paperwork was done and the city had settled into the deep quiet before dawn, they moved him to a cell. The metal door clanged shut, the sound sharp in the stillness. Lucky lay back on the thin mattress, hands behind his head, staring at the ceiling. He thought about all the ceilings he'd stared at, the one in his mother's tenement, cracked and yellow, the one in a brothel where deals were whispered between sheets, the one in the Waldorf Astoria suite, painted gold. This one was plain white and cold. But ceilings were just ceilings. He'd always been more interested in what was going on under the floorboards. Somewhere in the city, a man was being told, "The boss says it's okay." Somewhere else, another man was being told, "The boss says it's not." And even here, in a cell with nothing but shadows and the faint hum of the pipes, Lucky Luciano was still the boss. The city knew it. The streets knew it. And if Dewey didn't know it yet, he would. He wasn't always lucky. Before the silk suits, before the commission, before the whispers on Mulberry Street carried his orders, he was just Salvatore, a skinny kid from Lercurafritti, a dusty little Sicilian town where the streets were made of dirt and the air smelled of bread and coal smoke. There, life was simple and brutal. The sun beat hard in the summers, the winters were cold enough to bite through your bones, and if you wanted to eat, you worked. His father, Antonio, worked the sulfur mines, coming home each night with his face blackened, his eyes tired but proud. His mother, Rosalia, kept the family fed on whatever coins made their way into the house. It was an honest life, but honesty didn't get you much in Sicily except calluses and debt. By 1906, Antonio had seen enough of that life. He'd heard the stories, America, the land where money grew on trees, or a man could earn in a day what took a week back home. So they packed what they could carry, boarded a ship, and crossed the Atlantic. Salvatore was 9 years old. The ocean was endless, and the nights were loud with the groans of the ship and the cries of seasick passengers. He remembered his mother keeping a tight hand on his shoulder, as if the new world might start before they reached land and she didn't want to lose him in the crowd. When they finally saw the Statue of Liberty rising through the morning haze, it didn't look like the postcards. It looked cold. Still, Ellis Island was a dream and a nightmare, long lines, strange languages, doctors poking at eyes and teeth. The Lucianos passed inspection and were given a number, then a ferry ride into the heart of New York. The Lower East Side was nothing like Sicily. The streets here were paved, but the pavement was cracked and crowded with pushcarts. The buildings leaned in over you, fire escapes hanging like iron spiderwebs. The smells were stronger too, bread baking, garbage rotting, fish frying, cigars burning. They crammed into a tenement on East 10th Street, one room for 6 people. The walls were thin enough to hear your neighbors arguing through the night. Rent took most of Antonio's pay from his job in a factory, but at least the children had a school to attend. For Salvatore, school was a battlefield. The Italian kids stuck together, but even among them there were rules: who you could talk to, who you couldn't, how to keep your head down when the Irish boys came looking for trouble. Salvatore didn't keep his head down. He learned quick that in America it wasn't enough to be tough, you had to be clever. He started charging smaller kids a penny for protection from bullies. Sometimes he actually protected them. Sometimes he didn't. Either way, the pennies added up. By the time he was a teenager, Salvatore had Americanized his name to Charles. Charlie Luciano had a sharper ring to it, something that could fit in on the street corners and in the pool halls. He was slick, with a smile that could open doors and eyes that measured every room before he stepped inside. He joined up with a gang called the 5 Points Juniors, a scrappy crew that ran errands for the older boys, delivering packages, collecting debts, sometimes stealing a wallet or two. The jobs were small, but the lessons were big. Loyalty mattered, but survival mattered more. It wasn't long before Charlie met Meyer Lansky, a sharp-minded Jewish kid with the same hunger in his eyes. They met in a street dice game. Lansky caught Charlie cheating, and instead of starting a fight, they started talking. They realized they had the same idea about the streets: money didn't care about religion or nationality. That was a dangerous idea in those days, when the Irish, Italians, and Jews all kept to their own. But for Charlie and Meyer, it was the beginning of a partnership that would last decades. Charlie's world was already expanding: poker games in backrooms, bootleg liquor runs, small-time shakedowns. He learned how to talk to cops without giving them anything, how to keep his mouth shut when it mattered, and how to make people feel like doing him a favor was doing themselves one. He picked up a scar above his right eye after refusing to hand over his coat to 3 toughs on the Bowery. After that, people started calling him Lucky, though whether it was for surviving the attack or just for having the kind of fortune that always seemed to fall his way, nobody could say for sure. By his late teens, Lucky had a reputation. Not the kind that gets your picture in the papers, not yet, but the kind that made older gangsters notice. He worked for Arnold Rothstein, the so-called brain of the underworld, a man who wore tailored suits and moved millions in gambling, drugs, and fixing the 1919 World Series. Rothstein taught Lucky that violence was a tool, but not the only one. Money and influence could do things bullets couldn't. "You want to run things, kid," Rothstein told him once over a hand of cards. "Learn the angles. Angles last longer than muscle." Still, muscle had its place. Lucky wasn't afraid to make a point when words didn't work. A man who stiffed him on a loan might find his store windows shattered the next morning. Someone who tried to cut in on his territory might disappear for a few days and come back with a limp. The trick, Lucky learned, was never to let it look personal. Business was business. That way, people feared you without hating you, and fear without hatred was a powerful currency. By the early 1920s, Prohibition had turned New York into a gold rush for anyone willing to ignore the law. Lucky was in the thick of it, moving liquor through a network of speakeasies, bribing cops to look the other way, and forming alliances that crossed the old ethnic lines. He was careful, always keeping one foot in the shadows and one in the light, dressing like a banker but thinking like a wolf. People said he was lucky, but luck had nothing to do with it. Every move was calculated. And yet, there were moments when the boy from Lurkura Friddy still surfaced. Nights when he'd walk past the bakery on Mulberry Street just to smell the bread, or when he'd send money back to relatives in Sicily. But even in those moments, his mind was always turning, thinking about territory, about the men he could trust, about the future he was building one quiet deal at a time. The streets had changed him. The boy who once clung to his mother's hand at Ellis Island had learned to walk alone, to keep his eyes forward and his back covered. He had outgrown the tenement walls, but he never forgot how small they made him feel. That memory of being small in a city that didn't care if you made it or not was the fuel he carried into every game, every meeting, every handshake. He wasn't going to be small again. Not here. Not anywhere. By the end of the 1920s, New York was a city split in two. Not by boroughs or bridges, but by bloodlines. On one side was Joe the Boss Masuria, a stocky, cigar-chomping powerhouse who ran his empire like an old Sicilian fortress, loyalty above all, change be damned. On the other was Salvatore Maranzano, tall and sharp as a knife, who preached the same Sicilian traditions but claimed he was the one to restore order. To the newspapers, it was just another gangland feud. To the men on the streets, it was war, a war that would turn sidewalks into killing fields and test the survival instincts of every man in the game. Charlie Lucky Luciano knew better than to pick a side too soon. Officially, he was Masuria's man. He collected, enforced, negotiated, always at the front table when the boss was holding court. But unofficially, Luciano kept his options open. He'd seen enough bodies in gutters to know that, in a war like this, loyalty could get you killed faster than betrayal. He kept in touch with Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and the rest of his close circle, men who understood that the future didn't belong to the old guard. It belonged to those willing to rewrite the rules. The streets were tense. In Little Italy, men who'd known each other since childhood crossed to the other side of the street to avoid a conversation that could get them killed. Every day brought news of another shooting: a driver slumped over his steering wheel in Brooklyn, a bakery owner found in the alley behind his shop, a bullet through his hat, still warm from his head. You could hear the war even when you couldn't see it: the quick footsteps behind you at night, the squeal of tires after a deal gone wrong, the click of a gun being cocked in the shadows. Luciano played the part of Masuria's loyal underboss perfectly. At the card tables, he laughed at the old man's jokes. At dinner, he poured the wine. But when Masuria turned away, Lucky's eyes were calculating, measuring. He knew the problem with Masuria wasn't just that he was stubborn, it was that he was blind to the world changing around him. The bootlegging profits were pouring in, but instead of building alliances, Masuria was making enemies, shaking down allies for more than their share. Maranzano wasn't much better. He wrapped his ambition in Sicilian proverbs and talk of honor, but his aim was the same: total control. The difference was that Maranzano was willing to deal with outsiders if it meant winning. That's where Luciano saw his opening. Through quiet channels, he let Maranzano's people know he was flexible. Not ready to turn his coat, but open to understanding the other side. It was dangerous. If Masuria even suspected, Luciano would be dead before he could finish his drink. But Lucky understood the value of playing both sides until one side played itself out. In private, he and Lansky talked about a new kind of organization, one without the constant blood feuds, one run like a corporation, with each family having a seat at the table. No one man at the top, but a board that kept the peace and kept the money flowing. It was an idea unheard of in the old Sicilian way, but in America, it made sense. The war dragged on for months. Each killing led to another, the violence climbing like a fever. Luciano kept his crew working, running liquor, collecting debts, keeping up the front of normal business, but always with one ear to the ground for the moment when the tide would turn. That moment came in early 1931, when it was clear that neither Masuria nor Maranzano could land the final blow without help. That's when Maranzano reached out through intermediaries and made his offer: help remove Masuria, and Luciano would have a seat at the table, a high one. It was the kind of deal that didn't come twice. Luciano accepted, but not with a handshake. He set the stage. On April 15, 1931, Masuria invited him to lunch at Nuova Villa Tomorrow in Coney Island. It was supposed to be just the two of them, cards and clams, a chance to talk business. Luciano arrived smiling, as always, the picture of loyalty. They played a few hands, ordered another round of food. Then Luciano excused himself to the restroom. While he was gone, four men walked in: Albert Anastasia, Vito Genovese, Joe Adonis, and Bugsy Siegel. They didn't sit down. They didn't order. They pulled their guns and fired. By the time Luciano came back, Masuria was slumped in his chair, the playing cards scattered across the table, the ace of spades lying in a pool of wine and blood. The newspapers called it a betrayal. The streets called it a change of season. Either way, the war wasn't over, not yet. Luciano kept his part of the bargain, meeting with Maranzano and accepting a position under the new regime. For a few months, it looked like Maranzano's rule might hold. He dressed himself as Julius Caesar, reorganized the families into 5 distinct factions, and crowned himself the Capo di Tutti Capi, the boss of all bosses. But power makes men greedy, and greed makes men careless. Maranzano began to suspect Luciano's ambitions. Word reached Lucky that Maranzano was plotting to have him killed, using Irish hitmen to avoid suspicion. That was all Luciano needed to hear. If Masuria had been a dying oak, Maranzano was a fresh weed, and Lucky wasn't going to let it grow. In September 1931, Luciano made his move. He sent a crew of men to Maranzano's office in the New York Central Building, disguised as government agents. They told the guards they were there to conduct an inspection. Once inside, they pulled knives and guns. Maranzano never had the chance to call for help. Within minutes, he was on the floor, his reign over, his dream of ruling unchallenged cut short. With both Masuria and Maranzano gone, the war was over. Luciano emerged not as the last man standing, but as the man who had pulled the strings, waited for his moment, and struck when the time was right. The bloodshed had been ruthless, but the streets were suddenly quiet. No more ambushes, no more gunfire in the alleys. That quiet was the sound of opportunity. Luciano stepped into the power vacuum with a plan already in place, the commission, the council of family heads that would prevent wars like this from happening again. It was the birth of a new order in the American underworld, one built not just on fear, but on structure. The men who sat at that table knew exactly who to thank for their new positions, and who to fear if they ever thought of challenging him. The Castellammare's war had made Lucky Luciano more than a gangster. It had made him a kingmaker. And as the city adjusted to its uneasy peace, he knew the real work was only beginning, the kind of work that would make him not just a name in the papers, but a legend in every backroom and alley from New York to Chicago. The war was over, but the city didn't celebrate. In the underworld, peace was never a parade, it was a negotiation. The streets had gone quiet, but quiet didn't mean safe. Quiet was a test. Every man who'd survived the Castellammare's war was watching the others, wondering who would make the first move, who would grab for more than his share. Lucky Luciano knew the answer, it would be him. But not with a gun. Not this time. This time, he was going to do something no boss before him had dared to try, take the chaos of the American Mafia and give it rules. He started small, inviting the heads of the surviving families to private dinners. No bodyguards, no guns on the table, just wine, pasta, and talk. At first, the old men were suspicious. They thought he was planning another trick, another double-cross. Luciano didn't rush them. He let them eat, let them drink, let them relax. Then he started asking questions. What if we didn't have to kill each other to do business? What if every family had its own territory, its own piece of the pie, and nobody crossed the lines? What if disputes could be settled with words instead of bullets? Some of them laughed. Others frowned. It sounded impossible. For decades, the Mafia had been a loose collection of bosses, each guarding his turf, each ready to go to war over an insult or a missed payment. But Luciano kept talking. He pointed to the bootlegging business, the gambling houses, the unions, all of them could be more profitable if the bloodshed stopped. Wars cost money. Dead men didn't pay debts. Police heat slowed business. A peaceful underworld meant more money for everyone. Behind the scenes, Luciano worked with Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello, the two men he trusted most to see the bigger picture. Lansky was the numbers man, calculating how much each family could make if the killing stopped. Costello was the politician, the man who could walk into a mayor's office and walk out with a handshake deal. Together, they mapped the city like generals planning a campaign. When the time was right, Luciano called a meeting not in a backroom or a smoky bar, but in a suite at the Roosevelt Hotel. Every major boss in New York was there, Vincent Mangano, Tommy Gagliano, Joseph Prophesy, and even Chicago's representative, Al Capone's men. There were no speeches, no grand declarations. Luciano simply laid out the plan, a governing body made up of the heads of the most powerful families, each with an equal vote. No single boss of bosses. Disputes settled by majority. Each family controlled its own business, but all worked together to expand profits and keep the peace. He called it the Commission. The old guard bristled. They were used to absolute power in their own worlds. But Luciano didn't threaten them, not directly. He reminded them of the war they just survived, of how many good earners had been buried in the past 2 years. He showed them the numbers Lansky had prepared, numbers that made the difference between being rich and being untouchable. Slowly, they began to nod. The idea of a council wasn't just about peace, it was about control. It gave them something to belong to, something bigger than their own neighborhoods. The first official meeting of the commission was a strange sight. Men who had tried to kill each other weeks before now sat at the same table, sipping espresso, discussing business like shareholders in a corporation. Luciano sat at the head, not as a dictator, but as a chairman. He made it clear, if you had a problem with another family, you brought it here. No ambushes. No unsanctioned hits. Any man who broke the rules would face all the other families, united against him. It worked. Within months, the shootings slowed. Profits climbed. The police, seeing the drop in gangland murders, shifted their focus to other crimes. Politicians stopped pushing for crackdowns when the streets stayed calm. The commission became the invisible hand that guided the underworld, deciding which rackets to expand, which territories to respect, which problems to solve quietly. Luciano didn't just stop with New York. He reached out to bosses in Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Philadelphia, New Orleans. The commission wasn't just a city council, it was a national board of directors for organized crime. Luciano understood that America was bigger than any one neighborhood, and that the real money flowed across state lines. By connecting the dots, he turned the Mafia into something no one could have imagined 20 years earlier, a nationwide network with shared rules, shared profits, and shared power. Of course, it wasn't all clean. Luciano still dealt with those who didn't play by the rules. A man who skimmed too much off the top or refused to honor agreements might vanish, his absence explained away as a business transfer or an accident. But those moves were the exception, not the rule. Violence became a tool of last resort, used to protect the system rather than destabilize it. For Luciano, this was more than a business model, it was his legacy. He'd grown up watching the old world bosses cling to power through fear and tradition, choking on their own stubbornness until someone younger and hungrier took their place. He wasn't going to make that mistake. The commission wasn't about him being on top forever, it was about making sure the system he built survived, no matter who sat in his chair. By the early 1930s, the results were undeniable. The Mafia was richer, more organized, and more stable than it had ever been. The newspapers, always eager for a headline, called it the golden age of the mob. Luciano didn't care what they called it. He cared that the machine was running smoothly, that his men were earning, and that no one could touch him without going through an entire network of bosses first. But even as the commission flourished, he knew it couldn't last forever. Peace had a way of making men lazy. Money made them greedy. And sooner or later, someone outside the underworld would notice just how well things were running. When that happened, it wouldn't be another mob boss coming for him. It would be the law, and the law didn't play by commission rules. By the mid-1930s, Charlie Lucky Luciano wasn't just a name whispered in the backrooms of Little Italy, he was a figure who could walk into the Waldorf Astoria and have the maitre d' greet him like an old friend. The commission had made him rich beyond imagination, but it was more than the money. It was the feeling of owning the city without ever holding the deed. Every streetlight, every bar, every craps table, somewhere, someone was paying him for the privilege of doing business. And the best part? Most of them didn't even know it. He dressed the part, tailored silk suits in shades of charcoal and midnight, custom-made in the finest Italian cuts. Hand-stitched leather shoes that clicked on marble floors like the tick of a clock you couldn't stop. A diamond tie pin just big enough to catch the light, but never so big it looked gaudy. Luciano understood presentation. You could be the most dangerous man in New York, but if you looked like a Wall Street banker, you could walk anywhere. His days started late, noon, maybe 1 o'clock. Breakfast wasn't eggs and toast, it was oysters on ice, champagne poured so cold the glass sweated in your hand. He'd take meetings in hotel suites, sometimes with politicians, sometimes with union bosses, sometimes with men who swore they weren't criminals but whose pockets told a different story. They'd sit, talk business, maybe take a drink, and by the time they left, they'd be part of Luciano's empire, whether they realized it or not. The shakedowns had evolved. Gone were the days of roughing up shopkeepers for a few dollars. This was business at scale. Construction companies, shipping firms, even movie studios, all of them found themselves protected by interests they couldn't quite name. If you wanted your goods unloaded at the docks without delays, you paid the right people. If you wanted your new nightclub to open without city inspectors crawling all over it, you paid the right people. And if you didn't? Your deliveries got lost, your liquor license took months instead of days, and your customers started going elsewhere. Luciano didn't always handle these matters personally. That was the beauty of it, layers upon layers between him and the street-level muscle. But every now and then, he made an appearance. Not to threaten, but to charm. A dinner invitation, a handshake, a promise that everything would be fine. Most men found that more terrifying than a gun in their face, because a promise from Luciano meant he'd already decided your future. The glamour was real, but it had a dark edge. Nights were spent in the city's most exclusive clubs, the Stork Club, the Cotton Club, El Morocco. He'd slide into a booth with a model on one side, a movie star on the other, jazz curling through the smoke-thick air. The waiters knew his drink before he asked. The bandleaders played his favorite tunes. Around him, the city's elite mingled without ever asking what business he was in. In their world, power was just another kind of wealth, and Luciano had it in spades. He never drank too much, never lost his edge. Even in a room full of laughter and music, his eyes were scanning, noting who was talking to who owed who was getting too close. That was the difference between a man playing gangster and a man who survived as one. You could wear silk, but you had to think steel. And then there were the cops. Not the beat cops, they were easy enough to keep happy with envelopes of cash or a little help for a cousin looking for work. No, the real problem was the detectives who didn't care about bribes, the special prosecutors looking to make a name. Luciano could feel the heat rising. Thomas Dewey's name came up more and more, a young district attorney with a reputation for going after big game. Luciano knew men like that. They didn't come for the small fry, they came for the man at the top, the man who made the headlines. Still, he didn't slow down. If anything, he leaned harder into the role. The more public he was, the more untouchable he looked. The more untouchable he looked, the harder it was for anyone to believe the stories whispered in the papers. He attended charity galas, posed for photographs with socialites, shook hands with men whose names appeared on bank buildings. In those moments, he was no longer just a gangster, he was a figure of New York society. But the streets remembered. The boys who worked the rackets, the enforcers who collected the envelopes, the drivers who made sure certain people got home safe, they all knew who he really was. And they loved him for it. Luciano wasn't just skimming off their work, he was building something that kept everyone fed, everyone safe from the chaos of the old days. If you were in his world, you had a piece of the dream. Of course, dreams don't last. Even as the champagne flowed and the money piled up, little cracks began to show. A union leader arrested here, a shipment seized there, a low-level guy flipping to save his own skin. None of it was enough to shake the foundation, but it was enough to make Luciano tighten the screws. The shakedowns got a little sharper. The envelopes got a little fatter. And behind the smile, behind the silk, there was the cold calculation of a man who knew the game was only fun if you stayed ahead of everyone else. One night, after a long dinner at the Waldorf, Luciano stepped out into the cool air and lit a cigarette. The city stretched out before him, glittering and endless. He thought about where he'd come from, the tenements, the gangs, the dirt under his fingernails, and where he stood now. It felt like the top of the world. But the thing about being on top was simple, there was only one way to go from there. Down. And somewhere in an office not far from where he stood, Thomas Dewey was already drawing up the plans to make that happen. It started small. A newspaper headline here, a whisper in a politician's ear there. A union boss Luciano barely remembered meeting got hauled in on corruption charges. Dock workers were questioned about who really ran the waterfront. The men on the street shrugged, kept their mouths shut, but the questions kept coming. To most, it looked like business as usual. To Luciano, it felt like the first hint of a storm rolling in from the horizon. Thomas Dewey was not like the others. He didn't take envelopes. He didn't look the other way when someone important came calling. He was young, sharp, and he had a taste for the kind of cases that made front-page news. In his mind, putting away Charles Lucky Luciano wasn't just a victory, it was the ticket to political immortality. And Dewey wasn't alone. He had a team of men who could sit in a dark room for days, combing through records, tracking phone calls, building a case one careful detail at a time. Luciano had dealt with lawmen before. Most could be distracted, bought, or scared off. Dewey was different. He had the kind of moral armor you couldn't slip a knife into. And worse, he had the public's attention. People loved the idea of a clean-cut prosecutor taking on the big bad mob boss. It was a story that sold papers, and every article made Luciano's name just a little bit more dangerous to have in print. Still, the city didn't stop for anyone's investigation. Luciano kept moving. He traveled between New York and Hot Springs, Arkansas, keeping his meetings away from prying eyes when possible. Hot Springs was his retreat, a little southern town with warm mineral baths and a police force happy to pretend they didn't know who he was. But no matter where he went, Dewey's shadow seemed to stretch just far enough to touch him. The first real sign of trouble came when one of Luciano's brothel madams got picked up. Normally, that was nothing new. Women in the life knew the risk, and they knew the rules. You kept your mouth shut, you did your time, and you came back to a warm welcome and a little extra cash. But Dewey's office didn't just want her to sit in jail. They wanted her to talk. It started with questions about the girls, the clients, the money. Then it moved to bigger questions: who was really running the show? The madam swore she didn't know anything, but Dewey didn't let go. He had her in a room for hours, days, wearing her down, dangling the promise of freedom if she could give them something worth taking to court. One name turned into two. Two turned into half a dozen. Before long, Dewey had a list of witnesses: women who'd worked the brothels, drivers who'd ferried them around, low-level muscle who'd looked the other way for a few bucks. They were all saying the same thing: the man at the top, the one pulling the strings, was Lucky Luciano. Luciano heard about it before the papers did. Word traveled fast in his world. He sat in a dimly lit backroom with his closest men, cigar smoke hanging heavy in the air, and listened to the details. "They're building something," one of his lieutenants said. "Piece by piece. They want to hit you with the whole thing at once." Luciano leaned back, eyes half closed, thinking. It wasn't fear, not yet. But there was a weight to the room, a sense that the easy days were over. Dewey wasn't just going after him for gambling or bootlegging. Those charges were too thin, too easy to shake. He was aiming for something that stuck, something ugly enough to make the jury turn their heads when they saw Luciano in his silk suit. Prostitution was perfect. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the romantic kind of crime you saw in the movies. It was dirty, and it painted the man at the top as a predator, not a businessman. The papers started running stories. "Vice Kingpin runs city's brothels," the headlines read. Luciano didn't need to read the articles to know they'd be full of half-truths and outright lies. But he also knew how the public worked. Once they saw you as guilty, proving otherwise didn't matter much. His lawyers told him to keep his head down, to avoid the clubs and the big public dinners. For a while, he listened. Meetings happened in apartments instead of hotel lobbies. Messages were passed through trusted couriers instead of phone lines. But the city was watching, and so was Dewey. Every move felt like it left a mark. Then came the raids. Dewey's men hit the brothels hard, kicking in doors, dragging out women and customers alike. It was chaos, the kind of chaos Luciano had worked years to keep out of his operations. The arrests piled up, and with them, the pressure. More people flipped. More people talked. One night, Luciano sat alone in his suite, a glass of rye in hand, the lights of the city glowing far below. He thought about all the moves he'd made, all the steps that had brought him here. He'd built something untouchable, or so he thought. But the truth was, no empire was immune to rot. Sometimes it came from the outside. Sometimes it came from within. He took a slow drink, the burn tracing down his throat, and made a decision. If Dewey wanted a fight, he'd get one. But it wouldn't be the kind fought with fists or bullets. This would be about information, about pressure, about making sure the men who mattered still had more to lose by siding with Dewey than with Lucky Luciano. Outside, the city moved on. Cabs rolled down wet streets. Steam rose from manholes. Somewhere, a jazz band played to a room full of people who didn't care about politics or prosecutions. But in a few quiet offices, in the minds of two men, the prosecutor and the gangster, the war had already begun. The knock on the door came before sunrise. Not the polite kind either, the kind that makes the hinges groan and rattles the frame. Luciano was in hot springs, stretched out in a silk robe when the pounding started. His first thought was one of his guys had gotten too drunk, too loud. But the voices outside weren't familiar. They were sharp, commanding. Lawmen. The local police chief was standing there when the door swung open, flanked by a couple of deputies who looked more nervous than tough. The chief didn't meet Luciano's eyes at first. "Charlie, we got a warrant," he said, the paper in his hand trembling just a little. It wasn't the local force's idea to come knocking. This order had come from higher up, much higher. Within minutes, the suite was swarming. Hands rifled through drawers. Cigar boxes were dumped out. The mineral bath downstairs, Luciano's little hideaway from the city, suddenly felt like a trap. They told him to get dressed. He took his time, buttoning each shirt cuff, slowly tying his tie with the same perfect knot he'd always worn. If they were going to drag him in, he'd look like a man who was still in charge. Word spread fast. By the time they marched him through the hotel lobby, people had gathered to watch. Some whispered, some stared openly, a few smiled, the kind of smile that comes when you see the mighty start to stumble. Cameras flashed as they led him out into the morning light, his fedora tilted just so, his face unreadable. Back in New York, Dewey was ready. The charges were in place, the witnesses prepped. Dozens of them, each with a piece of the puzzle, former madams, working girls, even men from Luciano's own network who'd been squeezed until they cracked. The case wasn't just about prostitution anymore. It was about showing the public that the man they'd once called untouchable was just another criminal hiding behind a fancy suit. They brought Luciano back east under heavy guard. The train ride was long, and every station they passed had people waiting just to get a glimpse. Some shouted his name, others hurled curses. It was a circus, and Luciano knew Dewey was loving every second. Public humiliation was part of the strategy. The first court appearance was chaos. Reporters jammed the hallways. The flashbulbs were blinding. Dewey stood at the front of the room, crisp suit, hair slicked back, looking every bit the young hero the papers had made him out to be. Luciano sat at the defense table, calm, almost bored, as though this were just another meeting. The prosecution laid it out piece by piece. Women told stories of being beaten when they didn't make quota, of being passed from one club to another without choice. Drivers testified about collecting envelopes of cash, delivering them to men who worked directly under Luciano. There was no smoking gun, no signed order, no photograph of Luciano in a brothel, but Dewey didn't need one. He was building something heavier, the weight of collective testimony, a wall of voices all pointing in the same direction. Luciano's lawyers pushed back. They painted the witnesses as liars, crooks, women trying to save their own skins by inventing stories. They pointed out the lack of physical evidence, the gaps in timelines. But in the court of public opinion, the verdict was already leaning. The people wanted to see the king of the underworld knocked off his throne. In the quieter moments, when court adjourned for the day and the noise of the cameras faded, Luciano would sit in his cell and think. He'd been in tight spots before, but this was different. This wasn't a rival crew or a crooked cop to pay off. This was the state itself, wrapped in the clean image of a man like Dewey, and they were coming for him with everything they had. The trial stretched on for weeks. Every day brought new headlines, new witnesses, new whispers that Luciano might actually lose. His men on the outside kept the businesses running, kept the money flowing, but they could feel it too, the ground shifting under their feet. Some started thinking about their own futures, wondering if the smart move was to get out before the whole thing came crashing down. And then the blow landed. One of his trusted lieutenants, a man who'd been close for years, took the stand for the prosecution. No warning, no hint beforehand. The betrayal hit harder than the testimony itself. Loyalty in Luciano's world was supposed to be absolute. But pressure did strange things to people. Dewey's team had found the crack and widened it until the man couldn't see another way out. When court adjourned that day, Luciano didn't say a word. He walked past the press without looking at them, past the guards without making a sound. Back in his cell, he lit a cigarette and stared at the wall. He knew what was coming. The rest was just a formality. The verdict, when it came, landed like a hammer. Guilty on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. 30 to 50 years in prison, effectively a life sentence. The courtroom erupted. Dewey shook hands with his team, reporters raced for the phones, and somewhere in the back, someone laughed. Luciano just nodded once, as if he'd already made peace with it. The papers the next day called it the end of an era. The Vice King dethroned. The man who once walked New York's streets untouchable now headed upstate in shackles. But if Dewey thought prison was the end of Lucky Luciano, he didn't understand the man at all. Power, in Luciano's mind, wasn't about where you sat. It was about who still answered when you called. As the train carried him north toward Clinton Correctional Facility, past towns and fields that didn't care who he was, Luciano sat with his hands cuffed and his mind working. If the outside world thought he was finished, maybe that was exactly what he needed them to think. The iron gates of Clinton Correctional closed behind him with a clang that echoed like the end of a chapter. Most men stepped through those gates and felt the weight of defeat settle on their shoulders. Luciano stepped through and took a slow look around, measuring the place like it was just another neighborhood he needed to understand. The cold air bit at his face, the smell of stone and steel was everywhere. They walked him down the long corridor, boots on concrete, the sound bouncing off the walls. Inmates turned their heads as he passed. Some knew the face from papers, others from whispered stories in the night. This wasn't just another inmate, this was Lucky. Some looked curious. Others looked cautious. The smart ones just looked away. They put him in a small cell, bare except for a bed, a thin blanket, and a table no bigger than a card box. The door shut and the echo lingered. But Luciano wasn't thinking about the walls. He was thinking about the people. In his world, stone and steel didn't stop power, only cutting the lines between a man and his network could do that. And those lines? He intended to keep them open. The first days, he played it quiet. He learned the routines. Who controlled the black market inside? Who ran the kitchen? Which guards had debts or bad habits they couldn't shake? Every prison was its own city, with its own streets and bosses. And like any city, it could be taken not with brute force, but with careful moves. His first move came in the yard. A small thing, breaking up a fight between two inmates without ever raising his voice. It wasn't about the fight, it was about showing the others that even behind bars, his word carried weight. A week later, he had a steady supply of good tobacco, better food, and small luxuries smuggled in by guards who were suddenly very friendly. On the outside, his organization didn't crumble like Dewey had imagined. Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, men who had worked with him for years, still respected his authority. Orders came in coded letters, passed through trusted couriers and visiting relatives. Sometimes they came in the form of legal consultations, lawyers sitting across from Luciano for hours, discussing more than just appeals. The guards began to notice the steady stream of visitors, the way certain inmates always seemed to get transferred to jobs in the kitchen or laundry after speaking with Luciano. Rumors spread that deals were being made right there in the visiting room, under everyone's nose. The warden didn't like it, but proving it was another matter. Luciano understood something most men didn't. In prison, the man who controlled the flow of goods and the flow of information controlled everything. He made sure that cigarettes, coffee, and protection passed through him. He didn't run the trades himself, no, he set up lieutenants inside, the same way he had on the outside. They answered to him, and they got to keep their cut. It wasn't long before disputes inside were being settled with a quiet word from his cell. A shift fight in the laundry stopped before it started because Luciano said so. Two rival gambling rings merged, paying him a percentage for keeping the peace. Even the guards noticed the difference: less violence, less chaos, and some of them preferred it that way. Meanwhile, outside the walls, his name still carried weight. The commission, the governing body of the Mafia he had helped create, didn't replace him. Officially, others took over certain territories, but everyone knew they were holding them for Lucky. Even in prison, he could tip the balance of power in New York with a single decision. One evening, during a quiet moment in the yard, an older inmate leaned in and asked him, "How you doing it, Charlie? Most guys come in here and fade away." Luciano just smiled. "Kid, the walls only keep you in if you believe they do." The warden made attempts to isolate him, moving him to different blocks, limiting visits. But every time, Luciano adapted. He'd build new lines of communication, turn a new guard into an ally, make the new cell block his own territory. It wasn't arrogance, it was strategy. His calm confidence began to change the atmosphere. Inmates who'd never met him before were now loyal. Guards who once saw him as just another crook were quietly taking favors. Even some administrators preferred the stability he brought, even if they'd never admit it. The irony wasn't lost on him. Dewey had locked him away to break his power, but all it had done was concentrate it. On the streets, there were dozens of moving parts. Inside, he had a captive audience. Every whisper, every favor, every deal passed through him first. Late at night, lying in his cell, Luciano thought about the streets he couldn't walk anymore, the smell of Mulberry Street, the shine of wet asphalt under street lamps, the low hum of life outside the clubs. He missed it, sure. But he wasn't finished. Not yet. This was just another angle. Another hustle. By the end of his second year inside, he'd done the impossible. He had turned prison into an office. Orders went out, money came in, disputes were handled. To the outside world, it was still Lucky City, even if the throne was made of stone and steel. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew the day would come when the state would need him again. Maybe not for crime, maybe for something bigger. But when that day came, he'd be ready to remind everyone, you could lock the man up, but you couldn't lock up his reach. It was a gray morning when the first hint of change came, though Luciano didn't see it at the time. A guard walked by his cell, eyes flicking toward him in a way that said something was brewing. In prison, news traveled faster than the food carts and with fewer details. Whispers said the Navy had been hit hard, that German U-boats were sinking ships right off America's coastline. New York Harbor, the beating heart of wartime supply lines, had become a hunting ground. Luciano didn't care much for politics. Wars came and went. Presidents changed. But ships burning in the harbor, that was a different matter. That was his city. His port. And in the underworld, the docks were as much a battlefield as the streets. Control of the waterfront meant control of everything that came in and out of New York. The visit came a week later. Not from his lawyer, not from a friend, but from a man in a clean navy suit, shoes polished to a mirror shine. The guard unlocked the cell and told Luciano he had a special meeting. They walked him through the corridors, past rooms he'd never been in before, into a small, smoke-filled office where two men waited. One was from Naval Intelligence. The other, he suspected, was there to keep the whole thing quiet. They got straight to it. "Mr. Luciano," the naval officer began, "we have a problem." And from what we understand, you have a solution. He went on to explain that sabotage and enemy infiltration at the docks were costing the Navy ships, supplies, and lives. No matter how many men they put on the piers, the leaks kept coming. Rumors said the Mafia controlled the waterfront, and if anyone could secure it, it was him. Luciano leaned back, studying them. The irony wasn't lost on him. Just a few years ago, the state had thrown everything they had to put him in here. Now they were knocking on his door. "Let me get this straight," he said, his voice calm, almost amused. "You're asking me to work for you?" The man in the suit didn't flinch. "We're asking you to work for your country." It was tempting to laugh, but Luciano wasn't stupid. This was leverage. He asked questions: how much authority he'd have, how far the cooperation would go, whether this little arrangement would come with considerations for his sentence. They were careful not to promise too much. But there was something in the officer's tone, in the way they avoided certain words, that told him they were desperate. Back in his cell, he thought about it. The docks had always been under mob influence: longshoremen, union bosses, protection rackets. If the Navy wanted them locked down, it could be done. But it would require more than just a few phone calls. It would require letting the outside world know, quietly, that Lucky was still in charge. The deal took shape over the next few weeks. Naval intelligence kept it unofficial: too many political risks if word got out they were working with a convicted crime boss. But word was sent to his people on the outside. Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner himself, was brought in to handle enforcement at the piers. Union leaders were told there would be no strikes, no disruptions, and no sabotage. Anyone caught helping the enemy would answer not to the Navy, but to the mob. Almost overnight, the mood on the waterfront changed. Ships were loaded faster. The sabotage stopped. Longshoremen worked like they knew someone was watching, someone who didn't file reports or wait for a judge's ruling. Inside the prison, Luciano felt the shift. Guards treated him with a new kind of respect, the wary kind that comes from knowing the man you're locking up might be saving your brother's life overseas. Even the warden stopped pretending he was just another inmate. Of course, there were those who didn't like it, both inside and out. Other mob figures saw an opportunity to undercut him. Federal agents bristled at the idea of partnering with organized crime. But Luciano knew the truth: power didn't care about morality. In a crisis, people would deal with whoever could deliver results. One rainy afternoon, the naval officer returned, this time with a faint smile. "It's working," he said simply. "No more fires. No more accidents. The docks are secure." He didn't say thank you, and Luciano didn't expect him to. In this business, gratitude was currency no one spent. The arrangement went on quietly for the rest of the war. Luciano never left the prison during the operation, but his reach extended from that cell to every pier in the harbor. The irony was almost poetic: Dewey's prize conviction had turned into a wartime asset. At night, lying in his bunk, Luciano thought about how strange it was. One minute, you're the city's most wanted man. The next, you're the silent guardian of the very same harbor they once accused you of bleeding dry. And through it all, he kept his expression the same: calm, calculating, unreadable. He knew the Navy wouldn't keep their end of the bargain forever. Promises made in desperation often faded in peacetime. But he also knew this: when the war ended, there'd be people in high places who remembered what he'd done. And in the quiet corners of power, that counted for more than any courtroom verdict. For now, he waited. Patient as ever. Because in his world, timing wasn't just everything, it was the only thing. And the day would come when the bars would open again. Not because he'd broken them, but because the people who put him there would need him free. The war had a way of making time slippery. Days bled into each other inside the prison walls, yet outside the world was moving fast. Ships came and went under the cover of night, soldiers shipped off by the tens of thousands, and the headlines were filled with names of places Luciano would never see: Sicily, Normandy, the Pacific. For him, the war was a quiet hum in the background until the visits from the men in suits began again. They never came in uniform now. Always civilian. Always discreet. Their faces changed, but their purpose didn't. They were there to check on the waterfront, to make sure the machine was still running without squeaks or sparks. It was better than ever. It was on one of those visits that the tone shifted. The man sitting across from Luciano wasn't a Navy officer or a field agent. He was older, the kind of man whose shoulders carried the weight of rooms full of whispers. He spoke carefully, almost as if every word was a chess piece. "You've done your part," he said, "and more." Luciano didn't answer right away. He'd been in too many rooms like this to rush. Instead, he leaned forward just enough to let the light catch his eyes. "That's good to hear. Now tell me what that's worth to you." The man didn't blink. "Officially? Nothing. Unofficially? There are conversations. Conversations. The kind of word that could change a man's life or sink it without a ripple." Luciano understood instantly. The war wasn't over yet, but the pieces were moving for the aftermath. Men like this didn't show up unless they were already laying the groundwork. Over the next few months, those conversations turned into murmurs. Murmurs into possibilities. Possibilities into whispers. Luciano's lawyer could almost confirm. Dewey's name came up often. Tomasi Dewey, the same man who had built his career by putting Lucky behind bars. He was governor now, his ambitions stretching toward the White House. He didn't need the headlines of an old mob conviction hanging around his neck while veterans came home and the city shifted into peacetime. The irony was sweet. The man who once called him the greatest gangster of our time might now be the one signing the papers to set him free. But Luciano wasn't naive. Dewey would never frame it as a favor. It would be about optics, politics, and making it look like a practical decision, a reward for wartime service dressed in the clean suit of civic duty. In the prison yard, Luciano's steps became slower, more deliberate. Other inmates watched him differently now. He'd always been respected, but there was something else in the air: expectation. The whispers weren't just in government offices, they were in the mess hall, in the showers, in the corners of the rec room. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Luciano was called to the warden's office. The warden, a man who had spent years pretending not to care who his most famous inmate was, now spoke with a curious politeness. "There's going to be a review of your case," he said. "You might want to be ready." Be ready. As if Luciano had done anything else his entire life. Every move he'd made since the day of his sentencing had been about this moment, keeping his network intact, making himself indispensable, turning even his prison cell into a command post. But he also knew this wasn't a straight path. Dewey would have enemies who'd object. Some in law enforcement would rather keep him locked away forever. Public opinion could sour with one bad headline. This would need to be handled like a delicate business deal: one wrong word in the wrong ear, and it was over. When word of the review reached his people on the outside, the machine kicked into gear. Friends in the unions spoke about how calm the docks had been during the war. Politicians who owed favors whispered about the importance of second chances in the press. Even a few high-ranking naval officers, off the record, admitted the truth: the man in Dannemora had kept the supply lines running. Luciano didn't push. That was the trick. You didn't grab at the bait, you let it come to you, reel itself in. Every conversation with his lawyer was about patience, about letting Dewey's people feel like they were the ones making the call. By late 1945, the war was over. Soldiers were coming home, parades were filling the streets, and the city was shifting back to its old rhythm. But in a few locked offices far from the noise, the last pieces of the bargain were falling into place. Dewey had his victory speeches, his parades, his public image polished and gleaming. And now, quietly, he could also have the satisfaction of tying off one of New York's wartime loose ends. The final meeting was almost casual. Luciano was told the state parole board would recommend commutation. The official line would be that his cooperation had served the national interest, that the governor's office was simply acknowledging the contribution. No mention of backroom deals. No mention of how many people had been leaned on to make it happen. When he returned to his cell that night, Luciano sat on his bunk in the dim light, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. He thought of the irony again, how prison had been meant to break him, but had only expanded his reach. How the same man who locked him up would now set him free, not because of mercy, but because the world had needed him. Outside, the snow was starting to fall. Inside, Lucky Luciano waited for the day the gates would open. He could already hear it, the clank of the lock, the swing of the door, the cold air on his face. But more than anything, he could feel the next move forming in his mind. Because this wasn't the end. It was just the quiet part before the next storm. The morning came cold and sharp, the kind of cold that woke you up before your feet even hit the ground. Luciano stood at the small metal sink in his cell, running water over his hands, feeling it sting his skin. He wasn't in a hurry, not outwardly, but inside, his pulse had its own rhythm. Today was the day. The whispers had turned into paperwork, the paperwork into signatures, and now all that was left was the final walk. The guard who came to his door wasn't one of the usuals. Younger, stiff in the shoulders, voice caught between authority and nerves. "Time to go," he said, avoiding eye contact. Luciano just gave him a slow nod, like this was the most natural thing in the world. He'd walked into this place like a man already planning his way out. Now he was walking out like a man who'd never doubted it. The gates in Dannemora didn't open all at once. It was a process, steel doors clanging, locks snapping open, each one giving way to another. The sound echoed down the corridors, and for a moment, it seemed like the whole prison knew. Men looked up from their cards, from their meals, from their endless pacing just to catch a glimpse. Some nodded. Some didn't dare. But the look in their eyes was the same, they knew they were watching a man who'd beaten the system without ever breaking stride. In the warden's office, a pile of documents waited. Release papers, conditions, the standard warnings about staying clean. The warden read them off without much conviction. "You're being deported immediately upon release," he said, as if trying to sour the moment. "Italy." Luciano smirked. "Yeah," he said. "I heard the food's better over there." The warden didn't answer. Maybe he knew it didn't matter. The terms of release were just another set of rules to work around. A black car waited outside the gates, its engine rumbling low. Snow crunched under his shoes as Luciano stepped into the daylight, and for the first time in years there was no fence, no watchtower overhead, no ice tracking him from behind bars. The air hit him like a drink after a long thirst, cold, clean, and full of possibilities. In the back seat of the car sat his lawyer, face split in a grin. "Well, Charlie, you did it." Luciano slid in, the door closing behind him with a heavy thud. "We did it," he corrected, though his tone was less gratitude and more confirmation. In his world, nobody got anywhere alone, but nobody stayed there without making sure the balance of favors was remembered. As the car rolled away from the prison, he kept his eyes on the rearview mirror. The place shrank into the distance, brick by brick, until it was just a shadow against the white. That was the past. The future was waiting in a ship's cabin bound for Europe. The trip to New York was a blur of back roads and quiet exchanges. No press at the gates, no parade, that wasn't the way this was going to be played. Dewey didn't want the spectacle, and neither did Luciano. Too many questions. Too many microphones. This wasn't about headlines, it was about momentum. At the pier, the ship loomed like a dark wall against the water. The wind off the harbor cut deep, but Luciano didn't flinch. He'd grown up in streets colder than this. The driver carried his single suitcase more for show than necessity, and the dockhands moved with the kind of respect that didn't come from fame alone. They knew who he was. They knew what he'd done. Before boarding, he paused, taking in the skyline one last time. New York. The city that had made him and caged him. The city he'd ruled from behind bars. The city that would still, in ways invisible to most, answer to his name. The ship's captain greeted him briefly, polite but distant. Maybe he'd been warned not to ask questions. Maybe he didn't need to. Luciano's cabin was small, private, and warm enough to shut out the winter. He set his suitcase down, sat on the bed, and let the hum of the engines fill the silence. That night, as the ship eased into the Atlantic, he stood on the deck, coat pulled tight, watching the lights of the harbor fade. There was no ceremony, no toast, no grand farewell. Just the steady churn of the water and the knowledge that every man on that ship had no idea they were sharing space with one of the most powerful men alive. But Luciano's mind wasn't on leaving. It was on arrival. Italy was not a punishment. Italy was an opportunity. The Americans thought they were removing him from the chessboard, but they didn't see the whole board. The Sicilian roots, the connections, the men who still owed him from decades past, they were all waiting. The game was simply moving to a different table. Below deck, he opened a small envelope his lawyer had handed him before parting ways. Inside was a folded sheet with a list of names, phone numbers, and a single sentence: "They're expecting you." Luciano smiled. The war had ended, but for him, the campaign was just beginning. He'd ruled in New York. He'd ruled from a cell. Now he would rule from the old country with the same steady hand and the same unshakable belief that power was never about where you stood. It was about who would still stand when you weren't in the room. The waves kept rolling. The ship kept moving east. And somewhere out there, across the dark water, was the next chapter of a story that wasn't close to finished. The first sight of Naples was like something out of a painting, the harbor opening into a sweep of pastel buildings, the haze of morning hanging low over Mount Vesuvius in the distance. Luciano stood at the rail, the sea wind lifting his hair, his coat collar turned up. The Atlantic crossing had been quiet, almost too quiet, but here the noise was immediate. Bells, gulls, voices calling from the docks. It wasn't New York, but it had its own pulse, its own smell: salt, diesel, and the faint sweetness of roasting chestnuts from street vendors he couldn't yet see. When the ship eased alongside the pier, he waited. No rush. Let the others push and jostle for their luggage. He'd learned long ago that the man who moves slow in a crowd is the one who draws the most eyes. The gangway dropped and the passengers trickled off. Luciano followed last, his steps measured. He didn't have to look for them, the men waiting at the bottom were impossible to miss. 3 of them, dark suits, hats low over their eyes. Not local police. Not government men. This was a reception committee of another kind. The tallest stepped forward, his face lined, his grip strong. "Benvenuto a casa, Signor Luciano," he said. "Welcome home." Home. The word felt strange. America had been his home since he was 9. But Italy was the soil his blood remembered, and Sicily, just a train and ferry ride south, was the root of it all. They led him through the crowd and into a waiting black sedan. No questions at customs, no delays. Someone had cleared the path ahead of time. As the car pulled away, Luciano let his gaze wander over the streets, scooters weaving between carts, laundry strung from balconies, children darting through alleys. It was raw, unpolished, alive in a way Manhattan hadn't been for years. The driver kept to the coast road, the Mediterranean flashing between cliffs. They stopped at a villa outside the city, pale stone with green shutters, the kind of place that whispered old money and quiet deals. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of lemon oil. A table was already set in the dining room. Wine. bread, olives. A proper welcome. The men who joined him were older, most in their 50s or 60s, voices low, laughter easy. But beneath it all was the current of business. These were not politicians. These were the local dons, men whose names carried weight in villages and port cities, men whose respect wasn't bought with cash but earned through power. One of them, a broad-shouldered man from Palermo, raised his glass. "To the future," he said. "And to the man who proved you can rule even from a cage." Luciano smiled, but he didn't correct him. The truth was, ruling from a cage had been easier than they thought because the cage had only ever been a room with a phone and a loyal network. Now, here, he had the same tools. Maybe better. Over the next few days, he moved like a man reacquainting himself with the streets, Naples, Rome, Palermo, each city a stop in an unspoken tour of introductions. The old bosses welcomed him. The younger ones watched him carefully. There was a difference between a legend in the papers and a man in the flesh. Luciano made sure they saw both. His English was still sharp, his Italian smooth but tinged with the New York street. It worked in his favor, he wasn't pretending to be one of them entirely. He was something else. Something bigger. A bridge between the old world and the new. He started small, or what looked small. A favor here. A shipment arranged there. A meeting between two men who hadn't spoken in years. No one could point to a single bold move, but the ripples spread fast. Within weeks, his name was being spoken in rooms he hadn't yet entered. The Americans had believed deportation would end his influence. Instead, it gave him a broader stage. The heroin routes that had once trickled into New York from Marseille now had a smoother channel through Sicily. The men in Naples knew how to move cargo without questions. The docks in Palermo could handle shipments in the dead of night. Luciano didn't have to be on the pier to oversee it. He just had to make sure the right men were. But it wasn't all business. There were nights he'd sit on the terrace of the villa, glass of red wine in hand, the sea black and endless before him, and think about the streets of Manhattan. The voices. The lights. The rush. He missed it. Not sentimentally, he missed the control. Italy was rich with opportunity, but New York was the crown jewel. And though he'd been told never to return, part of him was already plotting a way back, even if only in the shadows. One evening, a messenger from Sicily arrived, dusty from travel. He carried a sealed envelope and nothing else. Inside was a single piece of paper, a name scrawled in bold ink. Luciano read it twice, then burned it in the ashtray beside him. No one asked what it meant. But within a week, a certain troublesome figure in Palermo had quietly disappeared, and the docks there ran smoother than they had in years. Word traveled. The Americans began hearing rumors that Lucky Luciano was pulling strings in Europe, that the drug trade was running better than ever, that even in exile, he was untouchable. Some dismissed it as old ghosts. Others knew better. Luciano didn't chase the spotlight. He'd learned that true power worked better in shadow. From the villa, from the quiet backrooms of restaurants in Palermo, from the private offices above Naples' busiest markets, he rebuilt his empire not as the head of a single city, but as the man who connected worlds. And yet, even with the sea at his doorstep and the respect of men who'd grown up in the same streets as his father, he knew this was just a chapter. The Americans had forced him out, but they hadn't erased him. One day, one way or another, the circle would close, and the man who had ruled from prison would find a way to stand again on the streets of New York. For now, Italy was his kingdom. And exile was just another word for expansion. The sea had its own way of telling time. In Naples, the waves rolled in and out with the seasons, and years slipped past without ceremony. Luciano had been in Italy long enough now that the streets no longer stared when he passed. He was no longer the American, he was just Lucky. The man you came to if you needed something done quietly, efficiently, without the trouble of courts or police. Age had settled into his bones, but not in his mind. His hair had silvered, his face lined, but his voice was still steady, and his handshake still firm enough to make a man think twice before crossing him. The villa had become both fortress and throne. The phone in the study rang less often now, but when it did, it was never for small matters. Luciano had built something here, not a replica of New York's commission, but a network. Ports in Naples, Palermo, and Genoa that moved more than anyone guessed. Smugglers, businessmen, politicians, all threads in a tapestry only he could see in full. He never boasted about it. That wasn't his style anymore. He let the work speak for itself. And yet, time was a debt no man could dodge forever. The late nights were harder. The cigarettes left a heavier taste. Sometimes, when the wind off the water was damp, his joints ached in a way that reminded him the game had been going for decades. The Americans still watched FBI agents in suits too clean for these streets sat in cafes pretending to read newspapers. They couldn't arrest him here, not without an excuse, but they wanted to make sure he stayed in Italy. They knew or suspected that even from this coastline, Luciano could make a phone call that changed the shape of their cities. Luciano found it amusing. They think they're guarding the borders, he told a visiting friend once. They don't realize the borders are in the mind. He spent more time in reflection now. Sometimes he'd walk the narrow streets alone, unannounced, slipping coins to kids playing stickball or stopping to talk to fishermen mending their nets. They didn't care about his past. To them, he was just an old man with sharp eyes and a voice that carried authority without needing to shout. But there were moments, especially at night, when the ghosts came back. The faces of friends long gone, Meyer Lansky's sharp grin, Vito Genovese's cold stare, Frank Costello's measured drawl. He'd think about the days when the commission was new, when the rules were being written for the first time. And he'd think about the price they all paid. By the mid-1960s, his health was faltering. He didn't talk about it much, but those closest to him noticed. The man who had once crossed oceans with nothing but a plan now moved slower, measured his steps. Still, he refused to vanish into quiet retirement. Deals were still made. Meetings were still taken. If a problem came up in the network, it was still his phone that rang. On January 26, 1962, Luciano agreed to meet a film producer from America at the Naples airport. The man wanted to make a movie about his life, a romanticized version, all flash and charm. Luciano wasn't sold on the idea, but curiosity got him to say yes. He arrived early, dressed sharp as always, dark suit, tie perfectly knotted, shoes polished. They say he was standing on the sidewalk just outside the terminal, the winter sun low in the sky, when the heart attack struck. No warning. One moment he was speaking, the next his words caught in his throat. He fell back against the wall, eyes closing as if the weight of decades had finally decided to settle. He was 64 years old. News traveled fast. In Italy, the papers called him the last great padrino. In America, headlines screamed his name like it was 1936 again. Some painted him as a criminal mastermind, others as a folk hero. The truth, as always, was somewhere in between, and Luciano would have liked it that way. The funeral in Naples drew hundreds. Old friends, young soldiers, curious onlookers. The smell of flowers filled the air, but beneath it was the salt of the sea. Men who had once sat at his table stood in silence. There were no speeches, no grand displays. Just a coffin, a prayer, and the quiet understanding that an era had closed. He was buried in St. John's Cemetery in Queens, New York, next to his parents. The city that had exiled him in life welcomed him back in death. And maybe, in some way, that was fitting. In the years that followed, his legend only grew. Movies, books, whispered stories in backrooms, they all carried his name. Young men who had never seen his face learned his rules: keep your friends close, your enemies closer. Never lie to a man you expect to trust you again. And above all, power is not in being seen, but in being obeyed. Even in death, Luciano was proof of a truth few understood, that influence doesn't end with exile, or prison, or even the grave. The moves you make ripple outward long after you're gone. And somewhere, in the rhythm of the waves against the Neapolitan shore, it's easy to imagine his voice low, steady, with that hint of amusement reminding anyone who'd listen that the game never really ends.